The sun over Mesopotamia hung low and heavy, bleeding through a sky filled with smoke. The air itself trembled with heat and the smell of burning wood and flesh. Haran, once a shining city devoted to the moon god, now lay in ruin. The ziggurat that had touched the heavens stood blackened and cracked, half hidden behind a storm of ash. The Assyrian army had arrived, and with their arrival, mercy vanished. For 40 long days, their siege engines pounded the walls. Their archers darkened the sky. Each dawn, the sound of battering rams echoed through the valley, and each night, the cries of the wounded drifted like prayers no god would answer. When the final gate gave way, the city collapsed upon itself. Streets that had once carried trade and laughter now ran with dust and despair. In the courtyard of the ruined palace stood Queen Aramea, widow of Haran's fallen king. Her robes were torn and dust clung to her hair, but her eyes were steady. Around her, her people were dragged to the square, chained and broken, but she remained still, like a figure carved from marble. The Assyrian general entered the courtyard, his bronze armor gleaming red in the firelight. His name was Naram-Sin. His soldiers followed behind, silent as wolves, their faces hidden by iron and fear. He spoke with the calm of a man who had seen 100 cities burn. He told her that Haran's gods had failed her, that defiance had a price, that resistance was a curse that could only end in submission. She looked at him without fear. Her voice, though tired, carried through the smoke. She told him that the gods of Haran had not fallen silent, only patient, that men who thought themselves divine always learned their lesson too late. The general's face hardened. He ordered his men to take her to the temple ruins, to wait for the king's judgment. She was led away as her city crumbled behind her. Far from the flames stood Belater, a royal scribe of the Assyrian court. His duty was to record victories, to immortalize the empire's power in lines of clay. He wrote of conquered cities, of tributes offered, of kings brought in chains before the throne. But as he watched Haran fall, something within him faltered. The queen's composure unsettled him. He saw no weakness in her, only the quiet strength of a world being buried alive. He dipped his stylus into clay and wrote a single line that would never be approved by the king. In the year of the great conquest, Haran was taken. His queen stood unbroken. He pressed the words deep into the clay, knowing that the empire might one day erase them, but hoping that the earth would remember. When the fires dimmed, the queen was brought before the Assyrian king himself, Ashurbanipal, ruler of Nineveh, master of 1,000 cities. The great hall glowed with torchlight. Its walls were carved with images of lions being hunted and prisoners kneeling before winged gods. Every stone whispered of power. The queen was made to kneel at the center. Her wrists were raw from rope, but she met the king's gaze. He studied her with the curiosity of a scholar examining a rare artifact. He asked her who had led her people into rebellion, which priests had guided them, which cities had offered them aid. She did not speak. He leaned forward, his voice low, telling her that her silence would not save her, that every rebellion is a lesson, and that her name would be remembered only as a warning. The queen raised her head and told him that all empires believe their cruelty will outlast the gods, and all discover too late that dust is the only throne that endures. The court fell silent. Even the guards hesitated. The king's expression did not change. He turned to his scribe and ordered the words to be recorded. Belater bent to his tablet, but he did not write what the king had said. Instead, he wrote what he saw. He wrote that in the eyes of the gods, even the conqueror trembles. Outside the palace, the temple of the moon god had become a ruin. The Assyrians had broken its statues and scattered its offerings. The sacred incense now burned as mockery, but an old priest still lived. His name was Nabu-Ramani, blind and trembling, his voice cracked by age and grief. When the queen was brought to him, he reached for her hands and whispered that the gods forget no cruelty, that the empire which mocked heaven would one day kneel in the dust. The queen told him that she would not weep. "Let the Assyrians write their stories in clay and blood," she said. "The gods will read the truth when their empire is gone." The next morning, The survivors of Haran were marched through the streets. The Assyrian soldiers carried idols and gold, dragging prisoners behind them. Belater walked among them, pressing new lines into the clay as he went. The strong believe they write history, he thought, but clay remembers the cries of the weak. He knew the words might never be seen, yet he wrote them anyway. Clay endures longer than kings. That night, the city of Haran burned until nothing was left but smoke rising into the stars. The Assyrians called it victory, but beneath the ashes, something ancient stirred. A whisper carried by the wind, a promise that every cruelty has its answer. In the royal archives, this conquest would be written as glorious. But those who lived through it gave it another name. They called it the beginning. The road to Nineveh stretched for weeks through a land that no longer felt alive. Smoke from the burned cities hung over the horizon, and every mile was marked by the empire's cruelty. The Assyrians had carved their warnings into the world itself. Flayed kings displayed at city gates, captives hung from poles along the royal road, rivers of dust and silence. Queen Aramea walked among the chained prisoners, her steps steady though her body ached from hunger and heat. Behind her, women from Haran carried their children on their backs. Some whispered prayers to gods who no longer answered. Others had stopped praying altogether. Belater followed the procession, writing as he walked. He had been ordered to record the triumph, to list the names of the captives and the weight of the treasures. But what he wrote in secret was not victory. He wrote of faces hollowed by grief and of a queen who refused to bow. After many days, the gates of Nineveh appeared, vast walls of stone, carved with scenes of conquest and power. The towers gleamed in the sunlight, rising above the Tigris like monuments to eternity. To those arriving in chains, it looked less like a city and more like a warning from heaven itself. The captives were led through the processional way, a road lined with statues of lions, bulls, and gods with wings spread wide. The people of Nineveh gathered to watch the procession. They threw dust in the air and chanted the name of their king. Aramea was forced to kneel before the palace steps. The crowd shouted for mercy, then for punishment, their voices a storm of contradictions. The soldiers displayed the treasures of Haran, gold, idols, scrolls, and the people cheered as if the gods themselves had been conquered. From a balcony above, King Ashurbanipal watched. He did not speak. His eyes followed the queen, calm and unreadable. When the ceremony ended, the captives were divided. The men were sent to the quarries and fields. The women were taken to the lower palaces to be kept as servants or tribute. The queen was given a chamber in the inner city, not a prison, but a gilded cage. The palace of Nineveh was a world of its own. Corridors lined with alabaster reliefs showed the king hunting lions, leading armies, and kneeling before the god Ashur. The smell of incense and oil filled the air. Every wall spoke of glory, yet beneath the beauty lay something colder, something that whispered of fear. Aramea spent her days in silence, guarded by soldiers and watched by attendants. She could see the gardens from her window, trees brought from distant lands, flowers that bloomed even in the heat. But beyond the garden walls, she could hear the cries of laborers, the sound of hammers striking stone. The empire was always building something, always consuming something else to survive. At night, she dreamed of Haran, of the temple bells, of her husband's laughter, of the moon god who had once watched over them. She woke to silence and stone. Belater was summoned often to the palace. The king trusted him to record decrees, royal visions, omens, and dreams. He wrote what he was told, yet his heart no longer belonged to the words of power. Every time he saw the queen, he felt the weight of what history would forget. He began to write on hidden tablets, small, unmarked pieces of clay that he kept buried beneath the floor of his quarters. He wrote of the queen's dignity, of her quiet defiance, of her belief that no empire could own the truth. He wrote that the conqueror is never as immortal as he believes. In the months that followed, rumors spread through Nineveh. Some said the queen of Haran spoke with spirits in the night. Others claimed that the moon god himself had cursed the city for her capture. Strange things began to happen. The Tigris overflowed its banks. Locusts destroyed the northern fields. A comet appeared above the city, red as blood. The priests declared it a test from the gods. The people whispered that it was an omen. Ashurbanipal dismissed it all as superstition. Yet something in his heart grew uneasy. He began to dream of cities collapsing, of lions walking through fire, of a woman in chains standing beneath a blood moon. He called for his seers, his astrologers, his generals. He demanded they read the stars and silence the fear. But the fear was already spreading. One night, when the city slept, Belater crept to the queen's chamber. He carried no tablet, no stylus, only a small piece of bread and a clay lamp. He told her that the people were afraid, that the omens were multiplying, that the priests whispered her name in secret. He asked what she would do if she were free. She looked through the window toward the distant river. Her voice was quiet, but steady. She said that no one is truly free, not the conqueror nor the conquered. But the truth can escape even the strongest walls. Belater did not answer. He only bowed his head. He understood that she was no longer only a prisoner. She had become a symbol, a silent echo of every city the empire had broken. In the following days, the king's dreams grew darker. He saw his armies scattered, his statues buried in sand, his name forgotten. He ordered new sacrifices, new rituals, more temples, more stone, as if building could delay the inevitable. The priests declared that the curse of Haran would fade if the queen of that city were purified in the temple of Ashur. The king agreed. A procession was prepared. The queen was dressed in white linen and gold. The people filled the temple square to watch. The high priest raised his hands and spoke of obedience, of the order of heaven, of the price of rebellion. But as the incense rose, a wind swept through the temple. The torches flickered. The carved wings of the gods seemed to shiver in the light. The old priest from Haran, Nabu Ramani, now a captive in Nineveh, lifted his head and began to chant. His voice echoed through the hall. He spoke of the moon and the river, of the forgotten gods who watched from the dust. The soldiers tried to silence him, but his voice only grew louder. The crowd trembled. The air grew heavy. Then came a sound, a low rumble from deep beneath the city. The earth shook, and one of the temple walls cracked from floor to ceiling. Panic spread through the courtyard. The queen stood still, her eyes closed, her face calm. Belater watched from the crowd. In that moment, he no longer saw a captive. He saw the face of something greater than the empire, something that no power could crush. That night, the king locked himself away. He refused counsel, refused food, refused sleep. He ordered the temple sealed and the old priest executed. But the whispers would not die. The people said that the gods had spoken through the quake, that the queen's defiance had reached the heavens. Some said they saw her walking the halls at night, her shadow carrying the light of the moon. Belater kept writing, his hidden tablets filling faster than ever. He wrote that the empire was cracking not from the outside, but from within. He wrote that the gods do not need to destroy what men will ruin themselves. The story of the queen spread beyond Nineveh, to Babylon, to the mountains, to the deserts. Traders spoke of her courage, and slaves whispered her name in prayer. She had become more than a woman. She had become a memory the empire could not erase. The summer that followed the quake was heavy with fear. The winds carried strange dust from the west, and the river's color darkened as if the earth itself bled into the Tigris. The empire that once seemed carved from stone began to tremble like a reed in the flood. King Ashurbanipal had grown older, though only months had passed. His hair, once black as obsidian, had turned the color of ash. His dreams were filled with voices, the voices of cities his armies had burned, of kings he had flayed, of women who had cursed his name. He walked through his palace halls and saw cracks in the walls, not large but spreading. The masons hurried to seal them, yet each day new ones appeared. It was as if the stone itself had begun to whisper rebellion. Outside the city, the armies of the Medes gathered. They came from the mountains, fierce and patient. With them marched the Babylonians, led by Nabopolassar, who had once sworn allegiance to Assyria but now sought vengeance for every city crushed beneath its boots. The allies built their camps along the riverbanks, their fires glowing like stars across the plains. They waited, knowing that the empire's strength had begun to rot from within. Inside the walls, the people of Nineveh lived in uneasy silence. Rations grew thin. The soldiers no longer marched with pride but with fear in their eyes. The scribes recorded fewer victories and more omens. Belater wrote still, though he knew that his words would never be read by the king. His secret tablets now filled a clay jar buried beneath the courtyard stones. He wrote not as a servant of power, but as a witness for the dead. He wrote that empires fall not when they are conquered, but when they begin to forget why they were built. In the queen's chamber, silence ruled. Aramea had not spoken since the day of the temple quake. Her hair had grown long and gray, yet her presence had not dimmed. Even her guards spoke softly in her presence. She spent hours watching the river through the lattice window, tracing its current toward the south, toward the ruins of Haran. Some nights she saw torches beyond the city walls and wondered if freedom had finally come, or if it was only another illusion sent by the gods. One evening, a soldier brought her a piece of clay. On it were words carved in haste, a message from Belater. It said that the enemies of Assyria had crossed the Zab River and were moving toward Nineveh. The siege would begin within days. The queen pressed her hand to the cold clay, and for the first time in years, she smiled. The siege came like thunder. The armies of the Medes and Babylonians surrounded Nineveh from every side. Arrows darkened the sky. Siege towers rolled forward like beasts of iron. The city's walls, which had defied countless wars, shook beneath the blows of battering rams. Inside, chaos grew. The king ordered sacrifices to every god in his temples, burning offerings day and night. He promised victory, yet even his own priests doubted. The people whispered that the gods had abandoned Nineveh and that the queen's curse had come to pass. The river swelled with rain. For weeks the Tigris rose higher, flooding the fields and undermining the city's foundations. The engineers begged the king to open the floodgates, but he refused, fearing it would make him look weak. Then came the night when the river broke its banks. A wall section near the northern gate collapsed with a roar, and the flood poured into the lower districts. The enemy seized their chance. Thousands of soldiers stormed through the breach, their torches lighting the sky like dawn made of fire. Belater ran through the palace corridors as the sound of battle drew near. He saw the statues of kings toppled, their faces shattered on marble floors. He saw priests burning scrolls, trying to erase the empire's memory before it could be taken. He found his way to the queen's chamber. She was already standing, calm as always. He told her that the city was lost. She nodded. She said that no city is ever truly lost, only remembered differently. Together they walked through the empty halls, past the reliefs of battles that now seemed childish in their arrogance. The firelight flickered on the carved faces of kings who had once believed themselves gods. Outside, the streets were a storm of flame and shouting. The invaders moved through the city with fury, tearing down banners, breaking open vaults, cutting down soldiers who still fought for a dead cause. In the temple of Ishtar, the high priest threw himself into the fire, crying out for mercy that would never come. The libraries burned. The great gardens turned to smoke. Belater and the queen reached the palace courtyard. The moon hung low and red above the river. He asked her to flee with him through the western gate. She looked toward the flames rising from the temple of Ashur and shook her head. She said she would not leave, that her story had to end where her people's story had begun. He fell to his knees, but she placed her hand on his head and told him to live, to carry the truth, not the glory. Then she turned and walked into the smoke. When the dawn came, Nineveh was gone. The great city of stone had turned to ruin. The walls that had once defied nations were broken like clay pots. The palaces were blackened shells. The river flowed through the heart of the city, carrying ashes toward the sea. Among the ruins, Belater dug with his hands until his fingers bled. He unearthed the jar of tablets and carried it to the riverbank. He watched as the sun rose, lighting the wreckage in gold. He buried the jar in the wet earth beneath a fallen tree and whispered a prayer, not to the gods of war or kings, but to memory itself. He prayed that someday, when all the empires were dust, someone would find these words and know that there had been truth among the ashes. Years later, travelers spoke of the ruins by the Tigris where nothing grew. They said the earth still glowed faintly at night, as if remembering the fire that had consumed it. They spoke of a queen who had defied her captors and a scribe who had carried her story through the darkness. And somewhere beneath the soil, the tablets remained, waiting for the day when silence would finally speak. That was how Nineveh fell, not only by sword or flood, but by the weight of its own cruelty. Its power was vast, but its mercy was empty. And in the end, it was not the gods who destroyed it, but the truth it tried to bury. The city of Nineveh was gone, its name whispered only by the wind that moved through the broken stones. Centuries passed. The Tigris changed its course, covering the ruins in silt and reeds. Kings came and fell. New empires rose, each one declaring itself eternal, each one forgetting the bones beneath its foundations. The land grew quiet. Shepherds grazed their flocks where palaces once stood. Children played among mounds that had once been royal courtyards. The world forgot the language carved into those ancient walls. But the earth did not forget. In the spring of a later age, long after even the memory of Assyria had faded, a group of diggers worked beneath a blazing sun. They were hired by a scholar from a distant land, a man named Callus, who had come from the cities beyond the sea. His face was pale, his voice patient, his hands worn from unrolling maps and tracing guesses. He believed that beneath the mounds of the north, an empire still slept. For months his workers dug through layers of dust and clay. They uncovered broken bricks, scorched pottery, bones turned white as chalk. Then, one morning, a boy's shovel struck something hard, a jar sealed with pitch, buried deep in the earth. Callus knelt beside it. His breath trembled as he brushed away the soil. When he lifted the jar, it felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried more than clay inside it, as if it carried a memory waiting to breathe again. He cracked the seal, and inside lay dozens of tablets, pressed with lines of cuneiform so fine they seemed like veins in stone. He did not yet know what they said, but he knew what he had found. That night, in the flickering light of his tent, Callus cleaned the first tablet and began to read. Slowly, painfully, he traced the marks with his eyes, his hands shaking. The words spoke of Haran, of a queen taken captive, of a city burned and a scribe who defied his king. Each line carried a voice that should have been lost. He read until dawn. When the sun rose, he sat motionless, the tablet resting on his knees. He felt the weight of time pressing upon him, and for the first time in his life, he did not think of glory or discovery. He thought of silence, of how long these words had waited to be heard. In the weeks that followed, he translated as much as he could. The tablets spoke of the fall of Haran, the captivity in Nineveh, the queen who refused to bow, and the empire that consumed itself in pride. They spoke, too, of what the Assyrians had done, not just with their swords but with their fear. They took the wives of conquered men and turned them into symbols of submission. They erased their names, their voices, their gods. They paraded them as trophies, calling it victory, never seeing that it was only despair painted in gold. But the tablets did not linger on revenge or shame. They lingered on endurance, on the power of memory to outlive cruelty. Each tablet ended with the same carved line. Clay remembers what men forget. When Callus finally returned to his homeland, he carried the tablets in crates lined with straw. In the port city, a crowd gathered to see them. Priests, scholars, and men of the state. They marveled at the markings but cared little for the meaning. To them, the find was history, not truth. They spoke of empires and kings, of artifacts and trade routes. They did not speak of the queen. They did not speak of the women whose names had been erased. Callus tried to tell them, but his voice was drowned by admiration and applause. In the museum halls, the tablets were placed behind glass, labeled as relics of conquest. Visitors came and went, staring at the writing without hearing it. Years passed again. Dust gathered on the display cases. A generation of scholars translated the tablets properly at last. And somewhere among the footnotes and archives, the voice of Queen Aramea began to take shape again. Her defiance, her calm before the king, her final walk into the fire. All of it emerged piece by piece, until her name returned to history. Students whispered it in lecture halls. Writers shaped it into plays. Artists painted her standing before the burning city, her eyes fixed not on her captors, but on the sky beyond them. And though none could prove her exact fate, everyone who read the tablets felt the same truth, that cruelty cannot bury dignity, that silence is only the beginning of remembrance. In the final tablet, Belater had written of the night before the city fell. He wrote that he had dreamed of a field of stone where no walls stood, and yet the air was filled with voices. He wrote that he understood then that his task was not to preserve an empire, but to record the heart that outlived it. He ended his words with a message not to gods or kings, but to anyone who would one day find them. Let whoever reads this know that we were here. Let them know that we loved our city, even as it burned. Let them know that the cruelty of men is vast, but not endless. Let them remember that clay never forgets. The tablets of Nineveh became one of the world's greatest discoveries. Yet few realized what they truly were. Not royal decrees, not temple records, but the conscience of a dying civilization. Every letter was a heartbeat from a past that refused to die. And somewhere, in the dust of that ancient land, where the Tigris still bends toward the horizon, a whisper lingers in the wind. The gods may forget, the kings may fall, but the words remain. In a quiet gallery, surrounded by glass and marble, a group of students stood before a case that held the tablets of Nineveh. The lights above them were soft, the air still. They read the engraved plaques that described an empire of conquest, a queen's defiance, and a scribe's final words. Most of them read quickly, moving on to the next exhibit. But one young woman stayed. Her reflection hovered on the glass as she traced the cuneiform lines with her eyes. She felt something stir, not pity, but recognition. Later, she would write in her notebook that these marks were not the ruins of a civilization, but the proof that humanity survives even when empires die. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine the man who carved those words. A scribe in a burning city, pressing his stylus into clay as the walls fell around him. A woman standing before her captors, refusing to kneel. They had lived and died thousands of years ago, but in that moment, they felt closer than the world outside the museum walls. Centuries may erase names, but cruelty leaves fingerprints. Every empire after Assyria learned the same lesson and forgot it again. Each new power built its monuments, wrote its own versions of glory, and buried its own shame beneath the soil. But every few centuries, the earth gives something back. A ruin, a tomb, a fragment of truth. And people remember, if only for a while. One evening, the young scholar returned to the museum after hours. She sat by the case, notebook open, and began to write her thesis. But as she wrote, her tone changed. It stopped being research. It became a confession, her own and humanity's. She wrote that the Assyrians were not monsters, but mirrors. That their cruelty was only a shadow cast by the hunger for power that still burns in every age. She wrote that Queen Aramea's story was not a tragedy, but a warning. That dignity, once broken, cannot be rebuilt with conquest. That every act of domination, whether in battle, in politics, or in silence, begins with the belief that someone else's suffering can be justified. And she wrote that the scribe Belater was not trying to save his king's name, but to save memory itself. She ended her work with his last line. Clay remembers what men forget. Far away, in the ruins of Mosul, another dig began. Local workers unearthed a new fragment of tablet, blackened by fire but still marked with signs. It contained the same stylus marks, the same hand. The archaeologists read the half-preserved sentence. It said, "May the future learn to listen before it burns again." No one knew who the words were meant for, but they reached everyone who read them. Years passed. The museum closed for restoration, and the tablets were moved to a new display, their story rewritten to include the queen's voice and the truth of the conquered. Visitors came from all over the world. Some took pictures and left. Others stayed, silent, unable to look away. Among them were people who had fled wars of their own, who saw in those ancient tablets the reflection of their pain. The same cruelty repeating in new languages, new flags, new weapons. For them, the tablets were not relics. They were reminders that what happened in Haran could happen anywhere, that every empire is only a heartbeat away from its own ruin, that memory is the last rebellion. In time, the story of Queen Aramea spread beyond history books. Her name appeared in poems, documentaries, and songs. Children learned of her courage not as myth, but as truth. And somewhere in the middle of the modern world, a world filled with noise and light and new forms of conquest, her silence still spoke. It said that strength without mercy is weakness, that memory without truth is empty, and that justice begins the moment someone decides to remember. One night, after the museum had closed, a cleaner walked through the gallery, his footsteps echoing softly. He paused before the glass case, studying the strange markings on the clay. He could not read them, but he felt something in their presence, a kind of stillness that reached beyond words. He whispered a prayer for the souls who had lived and died long before him, and as he turned off the lights, the tablets caught one last shimmer of reflection from the glass. For a heartbeat, it almost looked like they were glowing. The earth outside was quiet again. The same river that once carried the ashes of Nineveh still flowed through the plains, its current steady, indifferent, eternal. Empires had come and gone. Faiths had risen and fallen. But beneath the surface, the clay endured. And somewhere in that silence, in the whisper of the river, in the breath of the wind through the reeds, one could almost hear it. The sound of a stylus pressing into clay. The sound of someone remembering. That is how history speaks. Not through kings or victories, but through the voices that refuse to be erased. And so, the story of what the Assyrians did, of the cruelty they justified, the defiance they could not crush, and the truth they tried to bury, became more than a warning. It became a mirror. For every time power rises without compassion, it is the same fire burning again. And every time someone tells the story, the world remembers before it forgets.